So 2 years ago, I have been here at Enigma to talk about my experience as a malware analyst investigating Brazilian malware samples. By that time, Brazilian malware samples were not well described in the literature, which motivated me to claim the need for an increased number of region-specific observational studies. But this is not the only challenge that one entering the security field would face while entering our field. Today, I present 5 other aspects to change to make our research field stronger. So come with me. Every research is potentially limited or flawed. My impression, however, is that this complaint is much more frequent and bigger in the security field. Maybe because the impacts of security flaws are huge. Anyway, everybody has its own concerns about the current state of our field. If we hear to the industry and to the practitioners, we will hear complaints about how slow-paced the research developments are, about how hard it is to transition to practice the research outcomes that we have, and also how we are failing to educate our students. If we listen to the academia, it also has its own complaints. It's also aware of its own limitations. The pioneers of the science of security movement already pointed out that the field has severe limitations, reporting experiment results and making experiments reproducible. My question here is, what's the actual size of this problem? And more importantly, how do we move forward? How do we solve these problems and try to find solutions? My point here is that we should acknowledge some problems so we can go towards a solution. So let's adopt the methodological position here that our security research is broken. I do not fully agree with that. I believe that research contributions from the past has led us to a better world nowadays than in the past. So these research contributions were very important. But let's act as a scientist here. So let's put this hypothesis and let's see what are its implications. So maybe we can find some ways to move forward. To support my claims, I will rely upon a paper that I published that is The Challenges and Pitfalls in Malware Research. It's a paper in which I review more than 400 papers published in the last 20 years in the top security venues, pointing out what are the challenges and pitfalls that we and other researchers face while developing security research. And here I talk more about malware because this is my background, this is the research field I work on, so I feel more comfortable to make some claims about it. But in fact, most of the outcomes that I present apply to any security domain. And it's also important to highlight here that what I'm proposing here, it's a reflection exercise, not a pointing finger exercise, even because my own research has many of these flaws that I present. So what I'm trying to do here is to pointing out what are the most common challenges and pitfalls that we have to face. There could be 20, as in the paper, but I chose to talk about the 5 most concerning ones in my views, starting right now. So the first one is that a first practice to change is to stop focusing on the same research types, because there are multiple research types, right? We have engineering solutions, there are typically the defenses that we propose, but also have offensive work, and also have observational studies. So how are these types of work distributed among our field? According to our literature review, we have a prevalence of all years of these engineering solutions. More than that, we have more engineering solutions than any other type of research combined. Typically, offensive work and observational studies are in a limited number in the literature. So is this a good thing? To claim something as good or bad, we need to have a model of what we consider the ideal, which in our case is the merge of the scientific method and the engineering method, because the security field is integrated and very complex. So we expect people first to observe the phenomenon in practice, to identify that it's something undesired, security violation, other problems, and then to propose hypotheses to handle that. It's basically the explanation of the scientific method, right? But to put this hypothesis to test, we need to develop sometimes very ingenious, very complex solutions, proof of concepts. There are the engineering solutions, so we have to merge these 2 methods. And according to these 2 methods, it was plausible to hypothesize that we would have a lot of observational studies, because these are the works that are proposing the hypothesis, right? So these are informing the development of future engineering solutions. But this is not what happens in practice, right? So we have much more engineering solutions. Why it happens? A first hypothesis could be that engineering solutions or defensive solutions are intrinsically harder to be implemented. So researchers need more attempts, so they end up publishing more papers. But this hypothesis is a bit weak. Another hypothesis is maybe researchers are not following this expected way of conducting research, so they are developing more independent way of taking project decisions. They are not basing their decision on previous observational studies, and they end up with solutions that do not perfectly match the operational scenario, so they have to refine and to refactor the solutions, which also end up in more papers being published. And what we discover is that this is exactly the scenario. The majority of the papers published in the literature are basically ad hoc decisions from the reviewers, in the sense that previous observational studies are not used to inform project decisions, to define the engineering solutions parameters, or to define the populations of the experimental settings. And why it happens? Well, one of the hypotheses is that there is a scarce number of observational studies to support this engineering solution. But this creates a cycle, right? So to move this field forward, a first thing is to break the cycle and to have more observationals from the field. More observational papers, and most importantly, make the information in these papers useful to inform the project decisions of the engineering solutions that we will develop. But this is just a first challenge. There are more challenges to come. A second challenge is to look more to the market and to the industry when developing these solutions. Because sometimes we, especially in academia, acknowledge sometimes live in a too ideal world, but the problems happen in the practice, in the actual world, so we need to look more to that when it's needed. The challenge here is, of course, to identify when it's needed. I'll present you two scenarios to try to help this identification. The first one are the target platforms. Right now, most of you, like 99%, are carrying a multi-core system on your pockets. But less than 1% of the works published in the literature are covering multi-core system right now. So this creates an understanding gap about this type of solution. And I know that's completely acceptable to develop single-core solution as proof of concepts that will be transitioned to practice as multi-core implementations in the future. But I'm talking here about understanding gap of specific phenomena. What about multi-core malware? What about distributed threats? How much examples of that, investigations of these phenomena can you find in the literature? Well, here I can point you to two, right? Another example of a mismatch between industry research and academics research is the use of signatures by antiviruses. Because the antivirus industry largely relies on signatures, not only on signatures, it's important to highlight, but largely rely on signatures because they are very effective for many tasks, they are compacted to be stored, fast to be matched, fast to be developed, although they have some drawbacks. But academics seems to prefer to work more with other approaches, typically machine learning approach, that are more flexible, are capable of detecting 0 days, but they also have drawbacks like the performance. And we can see in the literature this practical divide. We can see that in the recent years, basically all papers are proposing machine learn-based detections and not signature detections. So my point here is how we academics want to cause impact in the real world if we are not studying the solutions that are actually used in the real world. And by that point, you might be thinking, okay, so the point is we should look to the market in the industry. This is the solution for everything, right? But it's not the case because the problem is complex. So in some cases, we should stop looking to the industry and to the market, because in some cases, the industry cannot provide a better answer than academia. Sometimes relying too much on the market might even cause harm to our experiments. For example, consider that we are implementing an experiment, performing an experiment, typical one to detect if something is malware or not, or if something is an attacker or not. We are training a machine learning classifier. That's the typical approach that is used. And we need to collect the positive case, like goodware data. Where does this goodware data came from? Well, in most experiments, according to our literature review, this data came from the crawling of internet repositories and also from marketplaces. What's the rationale about that? Researchers are basically trying to reproduce the real world. They are ranking these repositories and trying to collect the most popular applications with the expectation that this reflects the applications that are actually used by the majority of users. This is a good intention. But as the good intention, the road to the hell is paved with good intentions, right? So there are also drawbacks here. A problem is there is no guarantee that these repositories are free from malware. There is no guarantee that these applications are not Trojanized. There is no guarantee that these applications are not bundled with spyware and unwanted software in general. So you might end up biasing your classifier to learn these lots of unintended behavior as benign. And one might say, okay, but the solution for that is to rely on an antivirus, to pre-scan all files to ensure that they are clear, right? Well, it happens that, once again, relying on antivirus is complex. Researchers rely on antivirus for a lot of tasks. More specifically, researchers rely on antivirus labels to train machine learning models and also to perform comparisons. We are always comparing if our results of our developed tools are better or worse than an antivirus. But as you can see in the figure, antivirus labels are not homogeneous. Antivirus labels, in fact, are very different depending on solution to solution. So for the same sample, as you can see here, different labels are generated. Even though we try to use some approach to make them homogeneous, it's problematic because the meaning of the label is different for each solution. Worse than that, the antivirus labels often do not provide very useful information research-wise. For instance, antivirus do not disclose what are the engines that generated that label. So it's hard to perform fair comparison. How can you compare your solution against an antivirus label in the case that if you are proposing a signature-based detection, you are comparing your solution with labels generated by antivirus using machine learning engine? Or on the opposite, if you are proposing a machine learning detection solution, you are comparing your result against labels generated by antivirus that use signature matching. So you might be understating or overstating the results of your experiment because of that. So the solution here is clearly not blindly rely on antivirus, not blindly rely on any software, any industry solution, but to have stronger methodology, to have standards, to have guidelines to perform these experiments. And academics are supposed to be good at developing guidelines and standards. And I say supposed because the scenario is not so simple. Once again, let's talk about an experiment. We are trying to classify something as malicious or not, and we have to define a data set size for this experiment. What's the ideal data set size? Well, in fact, we do not know, right? So you can see here there is no pattern in the works published in the literature. We have data set size of all size in the literature, authors trying to prove multiple claims using different data set size. Even worse, sometimes there are contradictory results. There are works saying that 1 million malware samples is enough to present a landscape of the malware scenarios, while others say that 1 million samples is the bare minimum number of samples to train a machine learning classifier. Once again, as I presented before, researchers seem to be taking sometimes ad hoc decisions. The only pattern that we can see here is that the median average of the data set is growing. And this is because of an effect that we call anchor bias. That is, in the absence of a guideline, what happens is that a previous study in that particular field becomes a reference for future developments. It establishes an anchor for future developments, so we start to want data sets bigger and bigger because of that. But you know, bigger is not necessarily the better, because in the end, we do not want a bigger data set size. We want a representative data set size. But as I told you 2 years ago, for the case of Brazilian malware samples, they were not represented in the literature, and many of these works do not represent many populations that are still vulnerable. This lack of guidelines also creates another problem, that is the reproducibility crisis. And I know, by that time, every scientific field has a reproducibility crisis to call yours, I know. But I would like to talk about the security one, because it's a little bit different. There are human factors and technological factors. So the human factors are related to our practice, so they are subject to change. Once again, we are developing an experiment, so we want to collect now malware samples or attack samples. And where do they come from? According to our literature review, they came from the crawling of internet repositories, now malicious one, and also from companies, partner companies that share their repositories. But since most of these companies are not research entities, they do not want to disclose how they were breached or which secrets were breached. So the data sets are often not available. And even though if they are security companies that actually worry about doing research, they do not want to disclose their commercial secrets, so how they collected these samples. So what happens is that in most cases, researchers are under NDA, non-disclosure agreements. So for the majority of the works in the literature, according to our literature review, the data sets are not available. So it's impossible to immediately reproduce the experiments as they are. But even though if we have access to all the samples, you still would have problems, because there are also the technological problem related to the nature of the problem. That is, if we have access to all the samples, there is no guarantee that running a malware experiment in the future will lead to the same result as in the present, because there is no guarantee that the malware sample will not download a different payload, that servers will be reachable, or that command and controls will not have been sinkholed. So there is still not a widely established way to perform this kind of experiment. So there is not a very widely established and accepted manner to reproduce malware and many other types of experiments that require this kind of reproducibility aspect. So considering that this is very important and we matter about that, these are really problems that we should solve, how to move forward? It's very complicated, but I have a few ideas. First of all, for us, as researchers, we should try to diversify more the types of work that we present. So basically, we should perform more longitudinal studies, more observational studies to provide useful data. We need data from the real world, from actual infections, from the prevalence of the affected populations, so we can better inform the development of the engineering solutions. And when we are wearing the hat of reviewers, program committees, or any other position of power, we should worry more about developing these guidelines, this best practice, these standards. We as a community should have a clear message. What is considered secured for us? What are the best practices in our view? What do we want to achieve with our experiments? So what's our goal in detecting some type of attack? This should be clear for us as a community, and it's not clear at the moment. And also for the field as a whole, I think we should stop worrying a lot about data set size and start worrying more about reproducibility. Because in the end, we do not study files. We study phenomena. We study effect. We study people. Right? So if you want to solve the data set size problem, let's establish as a guideline that the good data set is the representative data set. If you want to solve the reproducibility problem, let's state that the solution is to study population. Do not matter the files. If we study in the same population, we are observing the same phenomena. So they will be reproducible, right? And of course, for our venues, let's be clear for the authors, for the presenters, that these types of different populations studies, observational studies, are welcome in very nice places like here at Enigma. This is just the tip of an iceberg, this beginning of a discussion. There's a lot to be talked about, but what I'd like to do here is to foster a discussion, so I'll be open here to discuss with you. Thanks a lot.